I'm so pleased to be here and have the chance to talk with you all about some of the work that we've been doing. As Indemonti noted, I'm from the University of Washington in Seattle, and I like to clarify for people that the University of Washington is not where Obama lives. He lives on the other side of the country. The University of Washington is in the northwest, and it's up near Canada, so we're very far north and very far west. University of Washington is a large public university. It has about 45,000 students and about 4,400 faculty. So it's a fairly big university. It has a lot of federal funding, so a lot of research happens there. I'm at the Center for Technology and Disability Studies, and we have several projects that tie into assistive technology and disability. One project that's sort of relevant is called the Washington Assistive Technology Program. And it's a program that we have where we provide demonstrations of assistive technology, and we also loan technology to people with disabilities so they can try it out before they buy it, if they're going to, or access it in some other way. We also have, as Indemonti noted, a program that focuses on helping people with disabilities to access their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we provide informational resources about the ADA. And then the program that's most relevant to my being here today is a program called the International Program on Disability Rehabilitation and Technology. And that's the program in which we're trying to focus on thinking about assistive technology in lower resourced settings. And we use that term rather than developing and rather than third world, because it focuses more on the kind of functional aspects of the challenge, which is resource challenges that are more related to infrastructure, access to electricity, and kind of the capacity in terms of the economy. We don't think of low resource settings as just being international in terms of other countries. The United States has a lot of low-resourced areas within the country as well, and so we hope to think about low-resourced broadly, so not just about low-resourced countries, but about low-resourced areas and how we can think about approaching those challenges that are found in lower resource settings. So today I'm going to talk about appropriate assistive technology for people with disabilities in the global context, and I'm going to start just by making sure we're all on the same page in terms of our understanding of disability and challenges people with disability face. I'll do that quickly because I think this audience is already pretty up to speed with that. And then wanted to spend a little time just talking about assistive tech. And I know that many of you know a lot about assistive technology, so I just want to briefly talk about kind of where we are now, what's available in the world in terms of assistive technology, and then to spend a little time talking about what the future could look like. What are innovations that we see coming in the future? And then, after we do that, to talk a little bit about what do those innovations say about how we think about disability and people with disabilities? And are those the right innovations? Or are there actually other innovations that would be maybe more appropriate and more helpful to people with disabilities? And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about appropriate technology and its role, especially in lower resource contexts. So you probably already know that the estimate for disability is that we have about 10 to 15% of the global population who have a disability. That number would be anywhere from 650 million to 1 billion people. And I tried to figure out what it would be in India. If I did my math right, it could be in the neighborhood of 200 million people who live with disability. We also know that 80% of people with disability live in lower resourced, or what we call developing countries. So the burden of disability is higher in lower resource settings than it is in higher income settings. And I'll just show you some statistics from the Global Burden of Disease study. If you follow across, you'll see that for hearing loss, there are about 7.4 million people with hearing loss in high-income countries, compared to 54.3 million in lower income countries. So you can see this big discrepancy between high income countries and lower income countries, just in the terms of the number of people with disabilities who live there. And obviously, this creates a problem, right? Because the resources, perhaps, to help people with disabilities live more independent and inclusive lives are in those higher income countries where there is a lower incidence of disability. If you look at the second row, 7.7 million in high income countries, individuals have vision problems, 68.1% in lower and middle income countries. So just to give you a sense of that discrepancy. So when we think about where should interventions go for people with disabilities, obviously low and middle income countries are where we need to be focusing. We know that we're likely to see more disability and more people with disability in our lifetimes. So across the world, we're an aging population. Some countries have faster growing aging populations than others, but all countries are moving in that direction. Right now, or rather in 2013, we had about 11.7% of the world population who were considered aging. If we project to 2050, it rises to about 21%. And that's relevant because as people age, they're more likely to experience disability, more likely to live long enough to experience disability. We also know from the Global Burden of Disease study that what used to be our big concern, infectious disease, maternal and child illness, malnutrition, while still big issues and still concerns, the trend for those conditions is decreasing. And that we're seeing fewer deaths and fewer illnesses from infectious disease and non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease and other kinds of neurodegenerative conditions are becoming the dominant cause of death and illness in the world. And we know that life expectancy globally has increased about 10 years, but people are more likely to spend those years living with some kind of disability or illness. So we know that disability is something that's not reducing, but actually increasing as we live longer, and as we have healthcare that allows us to live when we might not have in the past. So why is that important? Well, disability is both a cause and a poverty is both a cause and a consequence. I said it wrong. I said it right the first time. Disability is the cause and consequence of poverty. So people who are living in poverty are more likely to experience a disability, and people who have disabilities are more likely to live in poverty. And there are a number of reasons why this is true. Disability limits people's ability to access health care and rehabilitation services that might help them reduce the effect of their disability. Disabilities associated with health problems that may cause and complicate disabilities like HIV/AIDS and malnutrition. People with disabilities have much less access to education and employment. This is a really big problem. And because of that, they have a hard time making a living. They also experience social exclusion that affects their ability to make a living. And finally, there's been some good work that shows that having a disability costs you more. It costs more to live with a disability because you have higher healthcare expenses, higher transportation expenses. You may have personal assistance expenses. If you're not able to pay for personal assistance, it may require a family member to not work so they can care for a person with disability. So having a disability actually is something that raises costs. And there's been a lot of work that helps us to understand kind of the right for people with disabilities to be engaged in development activities. Right to development can be thought of in a couple of ways. One is the right to participate in development activities, and that's something that CDR has been obviously engaged in, ensuring that people with disabilities are included within development activities and are not excluded from participation in those activities. But you can also think about it as just more broadly the right to develop, the right to become what you can become. Many of us here are educators, and we spend our lives helping students to reach their potential. And so when we think about the right to develop, it's about ensuring that people with disabilities have that same right. that they have the right to grow, they have the right to achieve their potential. And Judge Kiba Mbaye from Senegal said, every man has a right to live and a right to live better, a right to improvement, if you will. And so this is part of what we understand when we think about inclusive development. Obviously, to address all the needs of people with disabilities, it's going to require a very broad approach. And today I'm not talking about everything that needs to be done, but I just want to acknowledge everything that needs to be done. So we have to think about policy and law and how that relates to social inclusion, access to human rights, reduction of stigma. You know, providing somebody with a piece of technology is not going to fix that. And so we have to focus on those issues. We have to think about accessible environments. I'm going to talk more about that issue, but technology and accessibility go hand in hand. And if you have one but not the other, you almost, it's not worth much. You have to have both. Access to assistive technology, which will be the focus of today, but also support for employment, support for access to education, being able to get the health services you need, the rehabilitation services you need. All of these are part of the bigger picture of what we need to think about. But today I'm talking about technology. And so let's talk a little bit about the role of technology in inclusive development. It really functions in two ways, and it's pretty critical for people with disabilities. First of all, technology provides access to programs, to environments, to jobs, to education that people with disabilities may not have access to otherwise. And because of that, it allows for participation in civic life, engagement with family, participation in working community, all of the things that we think of as having value to us as human beings, things that are really critical for living a full and complete life. Technology and development, we can think of it in two different ways. One is assistive technology, which I'm going to talk more about. The other is ICT, information and communication technologies. And you all know this better than I do, but in the development world, we're having a proliferation of apps that are being developed that are supposed to solve all sorts of problems. And that's great, except if those apps are not developed in a way that are accessible for people with disabilities, that work with the assistive technologies that they use, then those apps designed to facilitate inclusive development will actually continue to exclude people with disabilities. And so we have to think about ensuring that any kind of technology development that happens within the context of accessibility for people with disabilities. Otherwise, we actually increase the discrimination in the programs where we're trying to reduce it. Assistive technology is not something that stands alone. A piece of technology doesn't stand by itself. It operates inside of a bigger technology system. And that system is made up of 4 parts. There's the person with a disability, and that person brings with them a skill set. Maybe they know how to use computers, maybe they don't. Maybe they have certain life experiences that help them in employment, maybe they don't. But that person is unique, and they want to do something. They want to go to school, they want to work, they want to go out and have coffee with a friend, they want to participate in civic life by voting. So there's an activity that somebody wants to do. And then there's some assistive technology that they use to do that. And all of that's within a broader context. And that context is very critical. And I want to talk about accessibility, because I can't really talk about assistive technology without talking about accessibility. So I have some images up on the screen. I have a man who's sitting in a motorized wheelchair, and then a plus sign next to him. And then I have a picture of a house that has a ramp that goes up into the house. And then I have an equal sign and it says access. And so this is just a graphic way of representing that accessibility is the relationship between what a person is able to do and what the environment requires them to do in order to do something, whatever they want to do. So in this case, this individual, if he wants to go in the house, he can do that because the environment, the ramp, allows him to enter the house. And so it's this relationship between the technology and the environment that actually creates accessibility. And without those two working together, then we don't actually have access. If this individual just had that nice motorized wheelchair, but he lived somewhere where there weren't ramps into houses, there weren't elevators that went from floor to floor, there weren't sidewalks, then that chair would be a nice place for him to sit, but it wouldn't take him anywhere, right? And so accessible environments are really critical. We often think about accessibility in terms of physical access. So we think about ramps, elevators, wider doorways, maybe bathrooms that have sinks at the right level, maybe braille signs so people can read signs. But as I noted before, we also have to really consider electronic accessibility, ICT, information communication technology. So computers, mobile phones, and maybe most critically, the World Wide Web. So, you know, the web has just been obviously kind of a mixed bag for everybody. Amazing good things in terms of information access and some things not so good. But if you don't have access to the World Wide Web, to the internet, then you don't have access to really this whole world of information that many of us rely on constantly. You know, I don't know about you, but I'm online all the time. And if I have a question, I just get on and I figure it out. We live in an information economy now. We have access to so much information so quickly that we didn't have access to before. And in many countries, that's not true in some countries. But to not have that access for a person with disability is really problematic. So how do we make things accessible? There really are two ways that we often think about. One is universal design, and the other is making reasonable accommodations. And I just want to quickly talk about each of those things, and then I'm going to actually talk about technology. So, you're probably familiar with the idea of universal design. It came out of the field of architecture. It was the idea that, as Ronald Mace stated, that the design of products and environments should be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or for specialized design. So this concept is just the idea that rather than designing for one type of human, right, only designing for somebody who walks on their feet, who uses both of their hands, who has a certain level of visual acuity, who can hear at a certain level, which is what we've always done, right? We build buildings with stairs because we just assume everybody walks. And that's an incorrect assumption. That's not accurate. The range of human diversity, when it comes to function, to what we're able to do, is much broader than that. And so what Mace was saying is, let's think about that first. So if we're going to build a building, let's build it for everybody who's going to use that building. Let's think about who all those people are. There are going to be people who don't walk, they use wheelchairs. There are going to be people who don't see. There are going to be people who don't hear, etc. And we need to think about that before we start building. So examples that I noted before, like ramps and elevators, but websites that work well with screen readers and screen magnifiers, cell phones that work with hearing aids. These are ideas that are related to universal design. So instead of trying to build something and fix it later, let's build something that works broadly for everybody from the beginning. Now, universal design is a really cool idea, but it's actually not possible to make everything 100% universally accessible. And so when we're not able to make things accessible, then as a society we have to agree that we're going to make reasonable accommodations for people with disability. We're going to make reasonable changes that will ensure that people with disabilities can participate. So things might be like, if we hire somebody who uses a wheelchair, we'll provide them with a desk that is modifiable in terms of its height so that the wheelchair can go underneath it. That'd be an accommodation. We might provide assistive technology for somebody who needs it if they were being hired into a company. We might need to provide accessible communication like TTY for people who are deaf so that they can communicate by phone. And we might even need to make changes to our policies. So, for example, if we had somebody with multiple sclerosis who fatigued easily, and we had a policy that said you only get 2 30-minute breaks every day, we might have to change that policy and say, okay, instead you can have 4 15-minute breaks because you need that spaced out time to rest. So these are all examples of accommodations and changes that we might make. And assistive technology is one of those accommodations, and that's what we'll focus on for the rest of today. So I wanted to spend a little time talking about just where we are now with assistive technology, and some of this may be something review for you all, maybe things you already know. But in other places I've talked, I found that there's sort of a narrow understanding of assistive technology, and I just want to make sure we understand a broad kind of perspective on AT. So you all probably know about walkers and canes and crutches and wheelchairs and all those things that are for mobility. Mobility is one of the bigger areas of assistive technology across the world. Most people know and understand about that. For people with limited hearing or who are deaf, you probably know about hearing aids, cochlear implants, FM systems. These are all technologies that I think are in fairly frequent use. For people with low vision or who are blind, I'm sure you've seen white canes, braille typewriters, magnification devices, screen enlargement devices, and screen readers, which are pretty commonly in use. Lots of prosthetics and orthotics. Those have been around in lower resource settings for a long time. Lots of work that's still going on to make those better and lighter and to fit more comfortably, but that's pretty common. And then finally, there's this category of sort of aids for daily living, things that help people button their pants independently so they don't have to have someone else do that. Maybe helping them get their shoes and pants on. Maybe if they can't hold a spoon, adapted dining utensils so they can eat by themselves. There's a whole class of technology that's really about helping people do their daily tasks independently without needing a lot of support. So those are some things that I think are in pretty common use. And I just wanted to talk about some things that are commonly available in probably more in higher resourced countries, but are definitely things that are commercially available and relatively easy to get if you have the money to buy them, because some of them are expensive. One class of those devices is augmentative and alternative communication devices. These are devices for people who are unable to speak fluently and clearly, or maybe not speak at all. And so I'm showing two pictures up here. The one on the left has a keyboard, a kind of a screen-based keyboard. If somebody were able to type and they knew how to type and spell, this is a system that they could use. They would type in what they want to say, and then they would have the device say it out loud too, so that we all could understand it. The device on the right looks very similar. It's a small square black box. In contrast though, instead of a keyboard, it has little images, little icons. And so for individuals who have not learned to read or write, they could use this icon-based system, touch the icon that they, or the series of icons to create a sentence, and the system would again speak for them. AAC, as we call this, augmentative and alternative communication, is really critical for people who can't speak. And you can imagine that not being able to speak is really frustrating, especially for children. We know that a lot of the acting out behavior we see in some kids with disabilities who are not able to speak is just frustration about not being able to communicate their wants and their needs. And so being able to provide communication access is really important. The ones I'm showing you here are kind of high-tech. They're obviously computer-based, but you probably know there's a lot of work around kind of simpler AAC systems using paper that work reasonably well as well. We know there's not a lot of access to AAC in lower resource settings, and we've seen some work in Kenya and a few other places to try to address that. There also are a lot of kind of new high-tech computer interface devices that are pretty cool. I have three of them up here. The one on the left is a gentleman who's sitting in a motorized wheelchair, and he has something that looks like a straw that he's holding in his mouth. This is a sip and puff switch, so he actually is able to control his motorized wheelchair using that switch by inhaling and exhaling through the device. That's kind of the functional capacity he has. He doesn't have use of his hands, so that's the system that he uses. To the middle there is an example of an eye gaze technology. So you see an individual looking at a computer screen, and his there's lines kind of triangulating his eyes on the screen. So this is a system that actually tracks the irises of his eyes, and where his eyes move, the cursor follows. When he wants to select something, he rests his eyes on that thing, and if he stays there long enough, we call it dwell. If he dwells long enough, that button activates and then takes him to the next screen. And so again, an individual who's not able to use his hands is able to control a computer slowly, but still able to have that access. The individual on the upper right-hand corner is using a kind of a mouth-based joystick, and so he's able to use his tongue and his lips to control that device, and he has it in his mouth again, kind of like a straw, and when he moves it to the left, the cursor moves to the left, just like a joystick, but he's using his mouth to control it. The main point I want you to take away from this, and this is like a tiny subset of the kinds of control interfaces that are available for computers. The main point to take away is that any functional, kind of consistent function that people have can be taken advantage of to help them access a computer. And so you see even people who the only thing they can do is hit a switch one time, those individuals with the right computer interface can control a computer, can type, can do all sorts of things. So you can imagine how liberating that is for someone who's not able to move in other ways. And so these computer interfaces devices are really, really important for a lot of people. You all, I'm sure, know about Braille, and have seen Braille typewriters, and have seen people Braille by hand. Maybe, how many of you seen these refreshable Braille systems? Okay. So refreshable Braille just takes Braille to the electronic world, basically. These devices connect into a computer. They have a single row of pins that pop up and down, and so line by line, it will recreate a Braille. It will recreate what's in text in Braille. And so people who read Braille can read through, and when they want to go to the next line, those little pins readjust into the new sentence, and they can continue to read through. I'm showing you two examples. One is kind of an older system that also has a keyboard. The one to the right is probably more commonly in use. It's a little square that sets separately from the laptop. You plug it in to the USB, and you can just carry it with you wherever you go, plug it into your computer, and have access to the computer through Braille. This is obviously useful only for people who read and write, or read Braille. Increasingly in the US, we're seeing that fewer people are actually learning to read Braille because screen readers have become so common. But this is pretty useful for people who read Braille. In addition, for people with some vision loss, there are a number of new apps that are being developed. So phone-based, mobile-based apps that help people in different ways. I'm showing three examples here. The one on the left is, in the US, all of our bills look the same. They're all green and they're all the same size. So nobody can use size and shape to identify their bills. So this is an app where the camera takes a picture of the bill and it tells you what the denomination is. So when you're spending money, you know that you're not giving a 20 when you should have given a 1. The one in the middle there shows somebody using the Google glasses, and he's looking at a can. And actually these two are similar. The one on the right shows somebody taking a picture of a can with a camera. These are object recognition or OCR, meaning that they're reading the text that's on the can. So if you pick up a can and you can't see it, and what you want is cream of mushroom soup, not cream of tomato soup, you want to be able to tell. And the only way, you can't tell by feel, so the only way is to have a system that will read it too. There are a number of devices for adaptive driving. These are pretty expensive systems, even for folks in the US, because they require vehicle modifications. But people can drive cars who only have really just control of one arm. So they can brake, they can accelerate, they can steer, all of that with a single arm. And folks who have using 2 arms can do it in slightly different ways, but adaptive driving is, again, one of those things that provides a ton of independence for people. In the US in particular, we're a highly car-driven kind of country, right? You can't get many places if you don't have a car. In the cities, we have often have good transit, but the spaces are quite large. So adaptive driving provides a lot of independence. I wanted to show you this. These are accessible voting machines. So voting is one of those things that's so important. You know, there are very few things that you really actually want to do all by yourself. But voting is one of those things. You don't want to sit down with your spouse who may not agree with you on your politics and have them fill out your vote for you, right? Because you can't check to see what they're putting down. Although I'm sure, you know, they wouldn't vote for who they want to vote for, but still, you can't check. And then they know who you voted for. Voting is like one of the primary things that you want to do independently. And so in the US, people with disabilities are, under our disability law, are required to have the opportunity to vote independently. And so we have a number of accessible voting machines. We have lots of challenges around accessible voting because not every precinct does it well. But it's something that we're working on a lot to ensure that you can fill out your ballot and cast your vote and do it completely independently without somebody around to do it for you. I have about 3 or 4 more kind of current technology, and then I'll talk about future tech. There's been an increasing interest in cognitive support technologies, so support for people with intellectual disabilities. And to some extent, many of these systems are extensions of the cognitive support technologies that that everybody uses. So anybody who uses a calendar is using a cognitive support device, right? If I didn't have things on my calendar, I wouldn't be here today. I would still be home. So all those things that we do, reminders, task lists, all of those are examples of cognitive support that we use. The question is, how do you develop cognitive support for people who have more difficulty in thinking? So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And here's an example from a company called Isr Technologies, and this is a task support system. So you can see, and it's called a visual assistant. So you can see that on the left-hand side, there's an example of a screen that shows a number of different tasks that a person might want to do. Make coffee, make a sandwich, change a tire, my morning routine. And so then if they select one of those, what they're going to get, and this is represented in the next 2 examples, is a step-by-step process with pictures and potentially with audio. So you're guiding them auditorily to complete that task. And so you can imagine for somebody who has, a lot of times people will be able to do like the first 2 parts of the task and then they'll get stuck. And then mom or a personal assistant has to remind them, oh, this is the next part of what you have to do. So the idea is, how could you increase independence for somebody so that they can do that on their own? And that's what these systems are for. You know, one thing I'll just note right now, because I keep using the word independence, and again, this is kind of a cultural thing, I think. In the US, we're all about independence, right? Everybody needs to do everything by themselves, right? The more independent you are, the better you are. And that's obviously not cross-cultural. Lots of other communities really consider family and community and more shared obligation to be important. So some of these technologies may not translate because they really are about trying to move people towards independence. And I just want to acknowledge that that's the case. Something happened with that slide, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, I know. Huh. This happened to me earlier too. I think it's something to do with the versions of PowerPoint. So what this slide was, which you're not going to be able to see, but I'll just explain it to you, was some examples about technology for people with learning disabilities. And so learning disabilities are disabilities where people have a discrepancy between their kind of overall performance and their ability to perform a specific skill. So we typically see learning disabilities focus on reading, writing, and to some extent mathematics. So in the US, I would say most people who have a learning disability have a reading disability. And they perform great in most other areas of their life, but they have really significant difficulty reading. And so there are a number of technologies for people with learning disabilities. A number of them are text-to-speech systems. They're different from screen readers because people with learning disabilities can see the screen, so they don't need the same kind of total control of the system that screen readers provide. But these are systems that help people with disabilities read. They often have highlighting that follows along with the words so that they can follow. They often have kind of note-taking pieces that go with them. And then there are just a number of things for helping students study better. One of the examples I had was those pens that you can write with, but as you're writing, they're recording the lecture. And then when you come back and you review your notes, you can touch on the notes and they'll read that part of the lecture to you. So those kinds of things are useful for people with learning disabilities. And there are also some sort of portable OCR systems, optical character recognition systems that help people to take print-based materials and turn those into electronic text. So last one for kind of currently available. I'd say this is relatively new, but there is a move towards the development of technologies for folks with mental illness and mental health conditions. And I have 3 examples up here. One is for people who have anxiety. This is a device called the Spire. It looks kind of like a little pebble with a clip on it, and you put that clip on your belt, and then it connects to an app. And what this does is it monitors your breathing rate, and it monitors the quality of your breathing. And if it finds that your breathing is becoming shallow or rapid, it will give you a prompt. And then it will, if you want it to, it'll walk you through a breathing activity that will help you to relax yourself. So something we probably all could benefit from sometimes, a little relaxation, but particularly useful for people who experience anxiety. The device next to it is kind of like a watch. It's called the Embrace Watch. It's a device that monitors stress. So it looks at heart rate. It actually collects GSR, galvanic skin response. And it's designed to monitor kind of indicators of stress. Again, it connects to an app. And then it helps you to understand kind of the relationship between when you're stressed, what's going on in the world around me, and when my stress is increased, and what can I do to reduce it. This device is also in testing to help people with epilepsy who may be experiencing many seizures to begin to capture when those happen and to record those. And then the picture over to the right is an example of an app. There are lots of apps in this space that are coming online. This is called the Wellness Tracker. And it's kind of a system for tracking how you're feeling, any symptoms that you're having, lifestyle issues, because things like diet and sleep really matter for all of us, but for folks with mental health for sure. Medication, so a lot of people with mental health conditions are taking medication, and it's challenging to keep on the right medication schedule. And so just an example of an app to help people stay on track with those things. So those are some examples of things that are available broadly in the world. You can buy now, and people are using them. I want to talk a little bit about some potential future innovations, things that maybe that I sort of see coming but not quite here yet. And I put the word some there because this is not all, just some that are in my mind. There's a lot happening in this space, and it's a really exciting and interesting space to be working in. So one thing I want to talk about is just independent transportation. the ability to get where you want to go by yourself. And again, there's that word independent. But independence is important in a lot of ways. Independent people don't need assistance or need less assistance from someone else. And so there's a balance between independence and caregiving demands. And so if we're interested in reducing the demands on caregivers, and those demands can be quite extensive, like family members or paid caregivers, then some level of independence is important. I have two pictures up here. The one on the left shows an individual in a manual wheelchair. He's rolling onto a bus. There's a ramp extended, and the bus is kind of, these are called kneeling buses. They have hydraulics, so they drop down so that the bus is almost at the level of the pavement. And then the ramp comes out, you can just ride onto the bus, and the hydraulics bring it back up again, and it takes off. These systems are actually not innovative. These are in most transit, metro transit buses that you'll find. But I want to show it to you because it's critical kind of to understand the next piece, which is where I see the next thing that's happening in transit, and that is really information systems for people with disabilities. And in this picture you see an individual, he has black sunglasses, he's holding a white cane, and he has a phone in his hand. And this is an example of a system that gives real-time data to people who are blind or who have visual impairment. So with his phone, he knows which bus, when his bus is coming, he knows when his bus has arrived. In other words, he knows that the bus that just pulled up is the number 32 and it's the one he wants to get on. And he also knows when he needs to get off. And so all of that kind of prompting through the app-based system that he's using. These are in place in a few metro areas. Part of the challenge for implementing them well is the infrastructure that has to go into making them work. All of your buses have to be GPS tagged, right, so that you know where they are. And there's a fair bit of infrastructure that goes into it, but I think this is definitely a part of the future for independent transportation. To go even sort of further out, we can start to talk about autonomous cars. And I'm sure many of you have read about these, and Google says they're going to have one in 10 years, and I think Ford says they're going to have one even sooner. And so there's a ton of money being spent on autonomous cars right now. And when I first heard this, I thought, that's ridiculous, that'll never happen. They've been promising that forever. But it sounds like they're making pretty significant kind of progress towards autonomous cars. People who should know say that they will be around. And for people with disabilities, for people who don't see well enough to drive, who don't have the fine motor control or the leg control to drive, perhaps people with intellectual disabilities who would get confused or are lost driving, just think again about the potential freedom of autonomous vehicles. Be able to hop in a car and have it take you where you want to go. It's a pretty cool idea. Of course, and we're going to talk about this more, all of these technologies bring their own challenges. Does everybody really need a car? What does that do to our infrastructure? But an example of one direction where this is moving. Switching up, I want to talk a little bit about 3D printing. This is another area that I think is really pushing forward in relation to disability. I have three pictures up on the screen. One is a 3D printer, the one on the left there. You can see there's a laptop, it has an image on it. Next to it is a square box. It has a little nozzle that's putting out plastic or material that's creating, in this case, a little globe. So that's kind of what a 3D printer looks like. They come in all different sizes and shapes, and they can use different kinds of materials. And in the world of disability, what they're primarily being used for is prosthetics and orthotics. And for example, the Google High Impact Challenge that just came through and funded a number of projects, I'd say over a quarter of those were 3D printing of prosthetics and orthotics. So I think this is the kind of thing where there's still some work to be done around rigidity of the device, having the right kind of templates, but they're already being used to create more comfortable sockets for prosthetics and to create prosthetic hands. And so I think this is actually more near term certainly than autonomous cars. I think there's a lot of work going on around caregiving and elder support, which applies to people with disabilities, motor impairments in particular, broadly. There are two examples here. A lot of this work is happening in Japan and in Europe, where they have a rapidly aging population, and they don't know what they're going to do about that because they don't have enough caregivers. And so the example on the left is an example of kind of a smart walker. It's designed to help somebody walk over irregular terrain, but it's also designed to kind of operate as what they call a mule. So you don't have to use it, it can just walk behind you and carry something. That's the general idea, carry something heavy. This is something that actually has been recently funded out of the NSF in the US, and so there's work that's going on there. The picture to the right is more about caregiver support. It's an individual who's wearing kind of an exoskeleton so that they can bend over and lift up somebody without injuring themselves. Caregivers are much more likely to hurt their backs and injure themselves than the rest of us, and so this is pretty critical. This picture just shows you some of what's happening in Japan around robotics. And it's kind of out there, but it's also, I mean, a lot of work and a lot of money is going into robotics, especially in Japan. And so there are two pictures. One is of a robot that kind of has a teddy bear face that is picking up an individual, acting as a personal caregiver. And the other is a system that is more of an in-home care assistant and allowing somebody to connect to maybe personal assistance. So those things are kind of far out, but they're probably coming. Another category I think that's future is, well, not even future, some of this is now, but the cool stuff is probably still coming, is something we call ubiquitous technology. It means technology everywhere. Sometimes people talk about the Internet of Things, embedded systems, those are other words that we talk about. And so I have two pictures here. One is of a house, and it's just showing a whole bunch of different technologies that are embedded into the house, you know, different kinds of sensors and remote monitoring and cameras and all sorts of sort of low-level sensors that are lumped together to create some kind of assistance for people. And then the picture on the right is an individual who's in a pretty large motor wheelchair, electric wheelchair. He has a screen that's placed in front of him and he's reclined. And this is a recent story. This individual has ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So he has control of his eyes. And he's living in a home that's been turned into a smart home, I guess. And so he's able to open his door, turn on his TV, leave his room, go to the elevator, operate the elevator, all of that with the system and his eye blinks. And so that's an example of how that technology can be really, again, open up independence for people that they might not have. Another thing I want to talk about is just sort of augmentation and replacement kind of work that's going on. This is obviously, I mean, in some ways that's what assistive technology is about, is some augmentation or replacement. But there's, some of this is to not even just replace, but even to make better than it was before. The first picture you see there is an individual who's trying out a system being developed by Microsoft for people who are blind to navigate a metro environment. And what that system does is it uses a little noise to orient you. And so you can still hear everything, but you hear the noise, and the noise helps you go in the right direction, because as it changes, you change your orientation to the noise. And it also gives you information along the way, like you just passed the Bank of America ATM, you just passed the Seattle Art Museum, and so it tells you, information that you would gather from your eyes if you could see. So it's a Pretty cool system. Again, its challenge is infrastructure. It requires the beacons be in place and be programmed, and so it's something that's not in wide use. The one in the middle is an example of an exoskeleton for people who have spinal cord injuries. This one is actually approved in the US by the FDA for sale. And so this is a system that fits over the legs. It's not very attractive, it's kind of big. But this is for someone who does not walk independently, and it allows her to, she has enough movement in her legs to activate the sensors to make the legs move, and then the legs provide the strength so that she can stand, and some of the balance so she can stand. She obviously uses canes to help with the balance as well. But these exoskeletons there are lots of them that are in development right now. And the one to the right, the picture to the right is one that you guys have probably seen. It's a runner using what's called a blade, a prosthetic blade. So it's almost like a little spring. And this is an example of something that actually allows somebody to run faster than they would with their legs if they have their original legs. And so augmenting beyond typical human capacity, an interesting kind of thing that's happening with assistive technology. This slide just shows a couple more pictures. There's work that's being done to try to provide some form of vision for people who are blind by creating neural interfaces. That's the picture on the left. The picture on the right is trying to basically replace the function of limbs. Not just a prosthetic, but a prosthetic that operates like the original, in this case, hand would have operated. So you can see that electrodes that go lower on the arm, those electrodes control the motor interface of the hand and allow for that kind of access. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of sort of future stuff is the way that technology and identity are becoming intertwined. The way that people are beginning to think about their technology as a part of them and a part of what defines them, in the same way that in disability, people are beginning to define themselves as a person with a disability, as a disabled person in some cases. So definitely we've seen that for a long time in the deaf community, where many people in the deaf community don't consider themselves to have a disability. They just consider themselves to have a difference, and they are pretty strong about that. We're seeing that as well in the community of people with autism. There are people who say, I'm not a person with autism, I am an autistic person. That is who I am. That's my identity. And I don't want you to reduce that identity and make me feel like it should be stigmatized. So I just have a couple pictures here. These are examples of hearing aids. The one on the left is a hearing aid that that kind of fits in her ear and allows her to hook earrings into it, so she can show off her personality with her earrings. And then the gentleman on the right has I don't know if you guys have this here, but in the US, some folks are into this kind of tribal thing where they expand their earlobes. And so that's what he's done. And he has a hearing aid that's shaped like a ring that fits into his expanded earlobe. And again, it's just an example of sort of that's who he is. He's not hiding that, he's celebrating that. I'll show you 3 more pictures related to that idea of tech and identity. This is the Alternative Limb Project, and these are all prosthetics. So you see the left, this is a prosthetic that actually has high heels that are part of it. And it's interesting because the front of it looks like a leg, and the back looks like a metal infrastructure kind of thing. It's kind of really high tech. The one in the middle is a full leg prosthetic, and it's been painted with beautiful flowers and trees. It's not intended to be hidden. It's intended to be shown off, right? To be celebrated. And the one to the right is I think the craziest one. It looks like you can see the bones of his leg. It looks like a skeleton, and then it has some kind of metal pieces wrapped around it. So these are examples of people who are taking their tech, they're making it part of who they are, celebrating it, and also kind of helping it to represent their identity. And I think that that's an interesting way to see how tech is being integrated. So here's my question. Now that we've gone through all of this, we've talked about kind of what exists, what might exist, and I have a question, and that is, what does the design of new assistive technology, what does that tell us about our understanding of disability and our priorities related to improving the lives of disabilities? Because I think when you look at the kinds of technologies that are being developed, you have to begin to question, what are we saying by designing technology that looks like this? What are we saying about people with disabilities? And what are we saying about how we prioritize people with disabilities or don't? So what I see in this is three things really. One question is, are we trying to change the person, or are we trying to change the environment? Those exoskeletons that I showed you, they're highly controversial, as they should be, because they're super expensive. There's a ton of R&D that went into them. And how many people do you think are going to be able to afford an exoskeleton? Not a lot, yeah? In contrast, what people say is, if you took all the money you put into developing exoskeletons and you improved the infrastructure of a town so that you had sidewalks so that people with wheelchairs could get where they need to go, wouldn't that be a better investment? And so there's this tension between kind of pushing towards what really is about trying to fix the person. And we've had the same argument about cochlear implants, for example, those kinds of things. Fix the person versus really fix the environment that they live in. And just accepting that disability is not something that needs to be fixed or changed, but really is part of the human condition and something that we need to adapt to more broadly as a society. So that's one question. The second question is, what are we talking about? Are we talking about high tech for a few or appropriate technology for many? And so those smart homes are a good example. Are we going to develop a few smart homes for a few people? Because they're very expensive. That smart home that I showed you, the company that runs that loses money on that. They can't, even with our social welfare system, they can't pay for that. So should we be thinking about things like smart homes, or should we be pushing for improved social welfare systems so that we can hire people to do some of the tasks that might happen in a smart home? And I think the last thing is, are these designs disability positive or are they disability dismissive? So when we think about things like bionic eyes and cochlear implants and stuff like that, essentially what we're saying is we need to fix you. We're kind of going back to that medical model of disability, and we're saying you need to have the same function that we have. Instead of really focusing on disability inclusion and disability acceptance and really approaching it from that perspective. So I think and those are tensions, right? I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with high tech. But there are tensions and paradoxes in the design that we're seeing coming out. And so we have to think, I think, about this within the context of who has access to assistive technology now. And what we know, which is, we don't have great data about this, but what we know is that only 5 to 15% of people who need assistive technology have access to assistive technology that they need. And that's probably an underestimate because it doesn't include all types of assistive technology. So given that, we know that there's this huge need for assistive technology. And I think that helps us to prioritize where our efforts should go in terms of high tech versus appropriate tech. I want to talk a little bit about why that need exists, and then I'm going to talk about appropriate technology, what that means, and then we'll wrap up and have some question and answer. I think access to assistive technology is challenged in a number of different ways. People have challenges before they get AT, and they have challenges after they receive AT. So one big challenge is awareness. People just don't know what's available, and they don't know how to get it. So that's one part of it. Indamati noted that we have a project in Southern Africa right now, and we talked with our collaborative organization there, Southern African Federation of Disabled Persons, about what the needs were. And what they said is people just don't know what exists and where to find it. And so we need to create systems that help them to understand where assistive technology lives. So that's why we're working on this assistive technology mapping project in Southern Africa. Affordability and access are obviously a really big problem. A lot of the systems you saw are pretty expensive. In the US, they tend to be medicalized, and some of them, so that they're paid through our Medicare system, and because of the not so effective way that works, many of them are more expensive than they ought to be. But affordability and access are a problem. There are also, there's a lack of appropriate products for people who may live in areas that don't have paved walkways and some of the infrastructural issues. Trained personnel is a big problem. I'm sure you guys have experienced that. Having appropriate training, adequate training, however you define that, and having people to provide services is a big issue. Then there are lots of challenges in production, manufacturing, and importing. My experience has been that, especially in lower resource settings, there's very little production of in-country assistive technology. And the work we're doing in Southern Africa, if you live in South Africa, some technology is developed in South Africa. A lot of technology is imported from Europe. But if you live in Botswana or Zimbabwe, I'd say nearly 100% of your technology is imported from South Africa. So there's no in-country production capacity. And this is something we've been talking about with Central University of Karnataka about, how do we develop social entrepreneurship, social businesses in countries to develop things within context. So then let's say somebody gets something that they need. Two big challenges that are often experienced. The first is just such a big problem, and that's maintenance and repair. You get a wheelchair, and sometimes that's expected to last you for 10 years. And if you can't have that wheelchair repaired somewhere, then after a few years it just becomes a piece of metal that's not super useful. The other is an issue especially for children, but also adults, and that is that as people's bodies change, as children grow, they need to have adjusted systems. And if they don't, they grow out of their assistive technology and then they don't have something. So these are all kind of the challenges that we see. And we know that 50% of assistive technology is abandoned, meaning that it's provided and then it's over time simply put away and not used. And why is that? Well, one of those is the reason I just noted. There are changes in sort of the functional abilities, what people can do, and changes in the desired activities, what they want to do of a person with disability. There's also often a failure to consider sort of the user options up front, and preferences in their device selection. Sometimes there's no training provided for using the system, and so the individual doesn't learn to function it at the right level, and so they get frustrated and they just give up. And then the issue I mentioned about lack of access to information about repair and maintenance. So, what do we do? Well, there's a fair bit of discussion, I think, in Chapo Isnavis of the WHO, who's a colleague, has talked about appropriate assistive technologies. So thinking about, how do we think about technology that suits the needs of the individual, that works in their environment, can be made available in their environment, can be maintained in their environment, and is affordable. And so really, appropriate technology really is appropriate for a context. So what's appropriate in Seattle may be different from what's appropriate in Bangalore, which may be different from what's appropriate in Gulbarga or Kalburgi. I'm still catching on with the names. So appropriate assistive technology really is about context. And so in lower resource settings, here are a couple of examples of devices that might be more appropriate for some lower resource settings. One to the left is a ruggedized wheelchair. It has big knobby tires on it. It has a long front wheels that allow for balance on rough terrain. It's sturdy. It's designed to be repaired easily. And so it's something that's appropriate in an environment where you don't have pavement and sidewalks and so forth. The other example, I think, of sort of appropriate technology is something you guys are already familiar with, and that's NVDA, Non-Visual Desktop Assistant. It's an open source screen reader. It's designed to be used on a flash drive, so you can carry it with you, and you don't have to have a computer that already has it loaded. And it's free. It's open source. And I checked. I'm not completely sure. You're going to have to tell me afterwards, but I think it's either being developed in Canada or already has been developed in Canada. So it's in 43 languages. And it's something that's not used heavily in the US because other commercial software came in first, like JAWS. But it is increasingly used, particularly in Africa, quite a bit. And so it's an example of a type of technology that may be more appropriate for that context. So what makes technology appropriate? A number of things. It needs to be acceptable to the user. They need to feel that it works for them, and it's something that they will use and they want to use. Obviously, it has to be affordable. Affordable is a context issue. What's affordable here is different from what's affordable in Norway. It needs to be of reasonable quality, and this is something that I think is important to highlight, and that is that low cost shouldn't mean low quality. Low cost should be something that we design for. It shouldn't be something that we use inferior materials and so forth to try to achieve. We have to think about how we get high quality, low cost. It needs to work within the infrastructure where it's going to be used. So if you've got sidewalks and ramps and elevators, then you've got some choices that are different from if you have areas that are not paved and big curb bumps and so forth. To the extent possible, we need to think about technology that's simple and maintenance-free, because we know that maintenance is such a problem. And then a really critical issue is this issue of fitting and getting people into the technology that they need, and doing that in a quick and efficient way. A lot of people don't, a lot of families in rural settings, if they don't work, they don't earn money and they don't eat, right? So they don't want to come in for 3 days to the city and spend all of that time to get a child fitted into, say, a wheelchair. That's just not effective, and so they won't come. And so we have to think about how do we get people fitted into systems and into assistive technology devices in a quick and rapid way. There's been a fair bit of work on that. To the extent possible, they should be locally repaired and maintained, and ideally developed out of locally kind of appropriate and available materials. So these are kind of a range of criteria that we can think about when we're thinking about how do we develop assistive technologies that are appropriate in a context. And again, these come from Chipal. The thing I think to keep in mind, though, is that design is not enough. Design isn't where we have to end. So we can design the most appropriate technology out there, but if we don't think about service provision, then we still have difficulties. So one thing to think about is how do we move services to the communities where the needs are. You know, there's a higher burden of disability in rural settings than in urban settings, and yet where are all the rehab centers? Where are all the kind of places where you might go to get technology? They're all in the urban setting. They're all in cities. And so people who are remote and distributed have much less access. And there has been some work, I know Sao Paulo has what they call a mobile rehab unit. It's basically a big truck that drives around from city to city, and people come in, they get fitted, the truck comes back and it brings them what they need. So these are examples of ways to decentralize services. And then another colleague of mine, Johan Rotenborg, has recently started talking about the need to really begin researching and developing how to simplify services. And it's a very interesting concept, and I think we'll see more work in this area. But what he says is, we need to ask, how can we develop assistive technology that is more easily provisioned, that doesn't require the kind of health professionals that we typically rely upon? How can we think about self-provisioning, or family provisioning, or community-based provisioning? how can we move, at least for some technologies that are maybe less specialized, away from a requirement of having a certain level of a health professional to provide them. And then the corollary to that is how do we develop those simplified services? So how do we train people in communities up to a level where they can provide the services? And maybe they might need to access some specialized help for some things, but they can do a lot of things. WHO has talked about this, they call it task shifting, kind of trying to reduce to try to create more generalists and people who can provide more services without the requirements of having high-level specialists. And then how do we develop policies and regulations to do that? And I think that question about simplified service combined with the bigger question of where service is provided and how design works, that those are the things that we need to begin thinking about if we really want to get access to the people who need it. So that's my last slide. And this is more to help us have a conversation. I'm sure this isn't sufficient or complete, but just some thoughts about how we increase access to appropriate assistive technology. Obviously, there's a need to develop awareness about types of AT that are available so that people understand their options. And this is really about information and helping people to know kind of what's available. I think, you know, it's if you can't imagine it, then you can't build it, right? And so there was a lot of work,